Aunt Claire was the kind of woman who always had her life in perfect order, or so everyone thought. She was the epitome of suburban perfection. A charming smile, perfectly styled hair, and a knack for hosting dinner parties that left everyone raving. But beneath her polished exterior was a restless energy she could no longer ignore. That night, as the summer breeze drifted through the open window of her study, Claire sat with a glass of wine in hand, staring at the unopened email on her laptop. The subject line read, "One night only, a reunion to remember." It was from Gavin, a name she hadn't heard in over 2 decades. Her first love. The boy who had written her letters from across the country when they were teenagers. The one who had promised her the moon and stars before life pulled them in opposite directions. Now, Gavin was back in town, hosting a one-night gathering at a jazz club downtown. The timing couldn't have been worse or better, depending on how Claire chose to look at it. Her husband, Greg, was away on a business trip, and their teenage daughter was staying with friends for the weekend. Claire was alone for the first time in years. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, nerves and excitement colliding in her chest. She'd been happy with Greg, or at least content. Their life together was stable, predictable, and entirely devoid of the fiery passion she once shared with Gavin. "Once is okay," she whispered to herself, as if saying it aloud would make it true. "Just one night. Greg will never know." Before she could change her mind, Claire clicked reply and typed, "I'll be there." The jazz club was tucked into a quiet corner of the city, its exterior unassuming but its interior alive with energy. The air was thick with the sound of a saxophone and the murmur of conversation. Claire stepped inside, her heart pounding in rhythm with the music. She felt out of place in her conservative floral dress, but the way Gavin's eyes lit up when he saw her erased all her insecurities. "Claire." His voice was warm and familiar, and for a moment, she felt like the 18-year-old girl who had fallen in love with him all those years ago. "Gavin," she replied, her lips curving into a smile she hadn't worn in years. They sat at a corner table, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine. Gavin regaled her with stories of his travels, his successes, and the adventures that had shaped him. Claire found herself laughing, leaning in closer, and hanging onto his every word. It wasn't until the band slowed the tempo with a sultry ballad that Gavin reached for her hand. "Dance with me," he said, his voice low and inviting. Claire hesitated, glancing around the room as if someone might recognize her. But the allure of the moment was too strong to resist. She let him lead her to the dance floor, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. For the first time in years, Claire felt alive. A sudden intrusion as they swayed to the music. Claire let herself forget about everything. Her marriage, her responsibilities, the risk she was taking. But just as the song ended, a voice shattered the spell. "Claire? Is that you?" She froze, her heart dropping like a stone. Turning slowly, she came face to face with Trisha, one of Greg's coworkers. Trisha's eyes flicked between Claire and Gavin, her expression equal parts amused and suspicious. "Trisha!" Claire exclaimed, forcing a laugh. "I didn't expect to see you here." "I could say the same," Trisha replied, her tone dripping with curiosity. Claire scrambled for an excuse. "This is Gavin, an old family friend. We ran into each other by chance, and he invited me to join him." Gavin, to his credit, played along. "It's been years since we've seen each other." "Pure coincidence, really?" Trisha didn't look convinced, but she didn't press the issue. "Well, enjoy your evening," she said, her smile sharp as she walked away. As soon as Trisha was out of earshot, Gavin leaned in. "Do you think she'll tell your husband?" Claire's stomach churned. "I don't know. She's not exactly discreet." "Maybe it's time to go," Gavin suggested. But Claire wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The reckless escape determined to salvage the night. Claire suggested they move to a quieter venue. Gavin agreed, and the two of them slipped out of the club, leaving the weight of Trisha's gaze behind. They ended up at a small speakeasy, hidden behind an unmarked door in an alleyway. The dim lighting and intimate atmosphere felt like stepping into another world, one where her choices didn't have consequences. They laughed, reminisced, and shared stories they'd never told anyone else. Claire felt a spark she hadn't realized she was missing, a sense of being seen and understood in a way Greg never quite managed. As the clock ticked past midnight, Gavin reached across the table, his fingers brushing hers. "Claire," he said softly, his gaze locking with hers. "I know this is crazy, but I never stopped thinking about you." Her breath caught in her throat. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge the pull she felt toward him, but guilt and fear tangled her thoughts. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Trisha. "We need to talk. Call me tomorrow." Claire's stomach twisted. Trisha knew something, and she wasn't going to let it go. A decision deferred. Gavin noticed the shift in her demeanor. "What's wrong?" "It's nothing," Claire said quickly, slipping her phone into her purse. I should probably get going." "I'll walk you out," Gavin offered, his expression tinged with concern. As they stepped into the cool night air, Claire felt the weight of reality settling back onto her shoulders. She had crossed a line, maybe not physically but emotionally, and now she would have to face the consequences. When Gavin leaned in to kiss her goodbye, she turned her head, his lips brushing her cheek instead. "Good night, Gavin," she said softly. As she drove home, Claire replayed the evening in her mind, torn between exhilaration and regret. What had started as a harmless escape had become something far more complicated, and she knew the morning would bring questions she wasn't ready to answer. The sunlight filtered through the blinds as Claire stirred awake, her heart sinking the moment reality caught up with her. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the night before. Gavin's smile, the dance, Trisha's sharp-eyed stare. Claire's phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Trisha. "Coffee? My treat. 10 a.m. at the bistro." Claire sat up, her pulse racing. She knew this wasn't just a casual invitation. It was an interrogation waiting to happen. The bistro confrontation. The bistro was bustling with its usual morning crowd when Claire arrived. Trisha was already seated at a corner table, her perfectly manicured nails tapping rhythmically on her coffee cup. "Claire," Trisha greeted her with a wide, insincere smile. "So glad you could make it." Claire sat down, forcing herself to match Trisha's fake warmth. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Trisha leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I couldn't stop thinking about last night. You and that man. Gavin, was it? You two looked so cozy." Claire's stomach churned, but she maintained her composure. "We're old friends, like I said. It was good to catch up." Trisha raised an eyebrow. "Old friends? You don't see your old friends dancing like that every day." Claire's temper flared. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I don't owe you an explanation." Trisha smirked, clearly enjoying Claire's discomfort. "Relax. I'm not going to tell Greg. But secrets have a funny way of coming out, don't they?" Claire clenched her jaw, her hands trembling under the table. "If you're done, I have things to do." As Claire walked away, her mind raced with a mix of fear and anger. Trisha hadn't explicitly threatened her, but the subtext was clear. Her life was no longer entirely in her control. A familiar face determined to distract herself, Claire stopped by the grocery store on her way home. As she wandered the aisles, a voice behind her said, "Claire!" She turned to find Gavin standing there, looking equally surprised. "Gavin," she said, her voice softening. "Funny running into you here," he said with a sheepish smile. Claire's cheeks flushed. "Yeah, small world." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Gavin spoke again. "Look, about last night. I hope I didn't make things harder for you." Claire shook her head. "It's not your fault. I didn't expect someone like Trisha to show up and start asking questions." Gavin frowned. "Who is she?" "Greg's coworker," Claire explained. "And she's nosy as hell." "Well, if there's anything I can do to help, let me know." Gavin said, his sincerity catching her off guard. Claire hesitated before nodding. Thanks, Gavin. I appreciate it. As they parted ways, Claire felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, a reminder of the connection they'd shared. The package when Claire arrived home, she found a package waiting on her doorstep. It was addressed to her with no return address. She carried it inside, her curiosity tinged with unease. Inside was a small, velvet box and a note that read, "For the memories we shared, G." Claire opened the box to find a delicate silver bracelet, its charm engraved with a single word, "Remember." Her heart ached as she ran her fingers over the charm. Gavin's gesture was sweet, but it also complicated things further. She couldn't keep it, not with Greg returning the next day. Just as she was deciding what to do, her phone buzzed. It was Greg. "Hey, Han," he said cheerfully. "I'm flying in tonight instead of tomorrow. Got done early. Can't wait to see you." Claire's stomach dropped. "Tonight? That's great," she managed to say, her voice strained. As soon as she hung up, she sprang into action. She needed to get rid of the bracelet before Greg arrived. A misstep, Claire decided to drop the bracelet off at Gavin's hotel. She scribbled a note, "I can't accept this, but thank you," and slipped it into the box. When she arrived at the hotel, the lobby was quiet, and the clerk barely glanced at her as she asked for Gavin's room number. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding. To her relief, Gavin answered quickly. "Claire," he said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" She held out the box. "I can't keep this. It's too much." Gavin looked hurt but accepted the box. "I just wanted to give you something to remember me by." Claire softened. "I'll always remember you, Gavin, but this is crossing a line." Before he could respond, the elevator dinged, and Claire froze as the doors opened to reveal Trisha. Trisha's eyes widened as she took in the scene. Claire standing outside Gavin's hotel room, visibly flustered. "Well, isn't this interesting?" Trisha said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Claire's mind raced. She needed an explanation, but nothing she came up with sounded believable. "I'm just dropping something off," she said weakly. Trisha smirked. "Of course you are." The clock is ticking by the time Claire made it home. Her nerves were shot. Trisha had seen enough to fuel her suspicions, and Greg would be home in a matter of hours. She spent the afternoon cleaning the house, trying to act normal, but her anxiety grew with each passing minute. When Greg finally walked through the door, his arms full of travel bags, Claire plastered on a smile and kissed him. "Welcome home," she said brightly. Greg beamed, oblivious to her inner turmoil. "It's good to be back." As they settled in for the evening, Claire's phone buzzed. It was a text from Trisha. "Your secret's safe for now, but secrets don't stay buried forever." Claire's blood ran cold. The tension simmered just below the surface as Claire navigated the next few days, her nerves fraying with every interaction. Greg, blissfully unaware, slipped back into their routine, but Claire couldn't help noticing the way Trisha's words lingered like a threat in the air. Trisha hadn't reached out again, but her silence was almost worse. Claire felt like she was living with a sword dangling over her head, waiting for it to fall. A growing suspicion one evening, as Claire sat at the dining table scrolling through her phone, Greg looked up from his laptop, his brow furrowed. "You've been a little distracted lately. Everything okay?" Claire's stomach tightened, but she forced a smile. "Just tired. There's been a lot going on." Greg studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Anything I should know about?" She froze, her heart hammering in her chest. Was he onto her? Had Trisha said something? "No, of course not," she said quickly, her voice a little too bright. "Just the usual stuff." Greg nodded slowly, but the flicker of doubt in his expression didn't fade. An unexpected invitation the next morning. Claire received a text from Trisha. "Drinks at Blue Ivy tonight? Thought we could chat. 7 p.m. Claire's first instinct was to decline, but she knew ignoring Trisha would only make things worse. She texted back, "Sure, see you then." When Claire arrived at the trendy rooftop bar, Trisha was already waiting, a glass of red wine in hand and a sly smile on her face. "Claire," Trisha said warmly, "you look lovely." Claire forced a polite smile as she slid into the chair opposite her. "What's this about, Trisha?" Trisha leaned back, swirling her wine lazily. "Oh, just a friendly chat. You've been on my mind since I ran into you and—" "What was his name again?" "Gavin." Claire's fingers tightened around her glass. "I told you, Gavin's an old friend. That's all." "Sure," Trisha said, her smile widening. "But you know, secrets have a funny way of coming out. It'd be a shame if Greg found out you've been meeting with an old friend while he's been working so hard for your family." Claire's blood ran cold. "Are you threatening me?" Trisha laughed, a sharp, mocking sound. "Of course not. I'm just saying it's always best to be honest. Don't you agree?" A confession that night. Claire sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. Trisha's veiled threats had pushed her into a corner, and the walls were closing in. She knew she had to say something to Greg before Trisha did. When Greg came upstairs, Claire took a deep breath. "Greg, can we talk?" He looked concerned as he sat down beside her. "What's wrong?" Claire hesitated, her heart pounding. "I ran into an old friend recently, Gavin. We went to high school together and he's been in town for a short while. I didn't tell you because I didn't want you to worry." Greg's expression hardened. "Why would I worry? It wasn't like that," Claire said quickly. "We just caught up. That's all." Greg studied her, his eyes searching hers for the truth. "Are you sure there's nothing else I need to know?" She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "I swear, Greg, there's nothing else." Greg sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't like the idea of you keeping things from me, Claire. But if you say it's nothing, I believe you." Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was short-lived. Deep down, she knew this wasn't over. A sudden turn the next day, Claire received an unexpected call from Gavin. "Claire," he said, his voice tense, "I think someone's been following me." Her heart skipped a beat. "What? Are you sure?" "Yes," Gavin said. "I've noticed the same car parked near my hotel the past few days, and last night, someone left a note on my windshield. It just said, 'Leave.'" Claire's hands trembled as she gripped the phone. "This is getting out of control. You need to be careful, Gavin." "I'm more worried about you," he said. "If this is about us, whoever it is might come after you too." Claire hung up, her mind racing. Was Trisha behind this? Or was there someone else pulling the strings? A mysterious encounter later that evening. As Claire walked to her car after running errands, she felt a prickle of unease. The parking lot was dimly lit, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder. A man in a dark hoodie was following her, his face obscured. "Can I help you?" she called out, her voice trembling. The man didn't respond. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. Shaken, Claire climbed into her car and locked the doors. As she drove home, her phone buzzed with a new message. "Be careful who you trust." Cracks in the foundation at home, Claire found Greg in his office, staring at his laptop with a grim expression. "Greg?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "Is everything okay?" He looked up, his face unreadable. "I got a call from Trisha today. She mentioned something about you spending time with an old boyfriend." Claire's blood ran cold. "Greg, it's not what you think. She also mentioned she saw you outside his hotel." Greg interrupted, his tone sharp. "Care to explain that?" Claire felt the walls closing in again. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Greg stood, his voice rising. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look? Trisha's been hinting at this all week, and now I have to sit here and wonder if my wife's been lying to me." Tears streamed down Claire's face. "Greg, I swear, I didn't do anything wrong. Gavin was just a reminder of my past. Nothing more. I never meant to hurt you." Greg's shoulders sagged as he sat back down, burying his face in his hands. I don't know what to believe anymore. Greg's doubt lingered in the air like a storm cloud. That night, he barely spoke to Claire, his usual warmth replaced with a distant coolness that left her feeling hollow. She stayed up long after he had gone to bed, staring at her phone, the cryptic message from earlier repeating in her mind. Be careful who you trust. Who was behind this? Was it Trisha, playing a dangerous game? Or was there someone else pulling the strings? And why target Gavin or her? A dangerous connection. The next morning, Claire decided to confront Trisha directly. She couldn't live in fear of what the woman might do next. She called Trisha and insisted on meeting her at a nearby cafe. Trisha arrived, fashionably late as always, her smug smile firmly in place. Claire, she said, her voice saccharine sweet. To what do I owe this pleasure? Claire leaned forward, her voice low but firm. Cut the games, Trisha. What are you trying to accomplish by meddling in my life? Trisha's smile widened. Oh, Claire, you give me too much credit. I just think people deserve to know the truth. Don't you? Stop pretending this is about morality, Claire snapped. You're enjoying this, but it's not going to work. Greg and I will get through this. Trisha's expression darkened. You think this is just about you and Greg? You're more naive than I thought. What are you talking about? Claire demanded. Trisha leaned back in her chair, a glint of satisfaction in her eyes. Let's just say, you're not the only one Gavin's been reconnecting with. A shocking revelation. Trisha's words haunted Claire as she drove home. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a petty coworker's scheming. Determined to find answers, she called Gavin. Gavin, we need to talk, she said, her voice tense. Trisha just told me something, and I need to know if it's true. Are there other women you've been meeting? There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Gavin sighed. Claire, it's not what you think. Then tell me, she pressed. I've been trying to tie up loose ends from my past, he admitted. You weren't the only person I reached out to. There were others, old friends, exes. I wanted to reconnect before it was too late. Claire's heart sank. Too late? What does that mean? Gavin hesitated. I didn't want to tell you like this, but I'm sick, Claire. The doctors found something a few months ago. It's serious. Her breath caught in her throat. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want your pity, he said softly. I just wanted to see you one last time. Claire's emotions swirled. Anger, sadness, guilt. But before she could respond, Gavin added, Claire, there's something else. I think Trisha is working with someone. I don't know who, but I've been getting threats ever since I came back to town. The masked threat that evening, Claire told Greg everything. She confessed about Gavin's illness, the threats, and her suspicion that someone was targeting her family. Greg listened quietly, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he sat back in his chair, letting out a heavy sigh. This is a mess, Claire, but I believe you. The relief was overwhelming. Thank you, she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. Greg nodded. We need to figure out who's behind this. Have you told Gavin to leave town? Not yet, Claire admitted. But I will. Before they could discuss further, the doorbell rang. Greg glanced at the clock. Who would come by this late? He opened the door to find a package on the doorstep with no delivery markings. Inside was a photograph of Claire and Gavin dancing at the jazz club, along with a single line scrawled in black ink. End this, or it will end you. The ultimatum. Claire's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph. Greg's face was a mix of fury and fear. This has gone too far, he said. We're calling the police. No, Claire said quickly, her voice shaking. Whoever this is, they want us to panic. We can't let them win. Greg's jaw tightened. Then what's your plan, Claire? Wait for them to come after us. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Gavin. Meet me at the park, midnight. I think I know who's behind this. Claire showed Greg the text. I need to go. You're not going alone, he said firmly. A midnight meeting at midnight, Claire and Greg arrived at the park, the shadows stretching long under the dim streetlights. Gavin was waiting near the fountain, his expression tense. "I'm glad you came," he said. "You said you know who's behind this," Claire prompted. Gavin nodded. "It's someone connected to me, someone I crossed a long time ago. I think they're trying to punish me by going after the people I care about." "Who?" Greg demanded. Before Gavin could answer, a figure emerged from the shadows. A tall man in a dark coat, his face obscured by a mask. "You couldn't leave well enough alone, could you?" the man said, his voice low and menacing. Claire's blood ran cold. "Who are you?" "You don't need to know my name," the man replied. "But you should know this. Gavin's past is dangerous. If you don't cut ties with him, you'll regret it." A standoff Greg stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Leave my wife out of this." The man laughed, the sound chilling. "Oh, Greg, you should have paid more attention to what your wife has been up to. Then again, maybe you already know." Claire's heart pounded as the tension in the air thickened. "What do you want from us?" she asked. "Simple," the man said. "Gavin disappears, and you two, you forget he ever existed." Before Claire could respond, the man turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving them shaken and unsure of what to do next. The tension between Claire, Greg, and Gavin was palpable as they returned home from the park. Each of them carried the weight of the masked man's warning, but no one dared speak first. It wasn't until they were seated in the living room, the clock ticking ominously, that Greg broke the silence. "This ends now," he said firmly, his eyes locked on Gavin. "Who is this guy? And what did you do to make him come after my wife?" Gavin ran a hand through his hair, his face pale. "I told you, he's someone I crossed years ago. A business deal gone wrong." Greg's jaw tightened. "You're going to have to do better than that." Claire looked at Gavin, her voice trembling. "Gavin, we can't help you if you don't tell us the truth." The unexpected connection. Gavin sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "Fine. His name is Nathan Klein. He's a fixer for some very dangerous people. Years ago, I uncovered evidence that he was laundering money through an art gallery I was working with. I exposed him, and he lost everything." Claire's stomach churned. "And now he's back for revenge?" Gavin nodded. "I think he's been watching me for months. When he saw I was reconnecting with people from my past, he saw an opportunity to strike." Greg frowned. "But why drag Claire into this? She has nothing to do with it." Gavin hesitated, guilt flashing across his face. "Because I told him she was the one I regretted losing the most." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "You what?" Greg snapped, his voice rising. "I didn't mean for this to happen," Gavin said quickly. "I thought I could handle it. I never wanted to put anyone in danger." A shocking betrayal before they could argue further. The front door burst open, and Trisha strode in, her heels clicking against the floor. "What the hell are you doing here?" Greg demanded. Trisha smirked, her eyes gleaming with malice. "Oh, Greg, don't act so surprised. I've been part of this from the start." Claire's blood ran cold. "You've been working with Nathan?" "Let's just say I owed him a favor," Trisha said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "And when he told me about Gavin's little reunion tour, I couldn't resist getting involved. Watching you squirm has been the highlight of my year." Greg stood, his fists clenched. "You're insane. Call me what you want," Trisha said, shrugging. "But you might want to think twice before calling the cops. Nathan's not the kind of man you want to cross." A desperate plan as Trisha left, her laughter echoing through the hallway. The weight of their predicament settled over them. "We need to figure out what Nathan really wants," Claire said, her mind racing. "If it's revenge, he's already made his point. But if it's something else..." Gavin nodded. "Nathan doesn't do anything without a reason. If we can figure out what he's after, maybe we can stop this." Greg crossed his arms, his face grim. "And how do you propose we do that? Invite him over for tea and ask nicely?" "No," Claire said, determination hardening her voice. "We set a trap." The trap with Gavin's help? Claire and Greg hatched a plan to draw Nathan out. Gavin sent him a message claiming to have documents proving Nathan's past crimes. The bait was simple. Meet at a public location, alone, and take the documents in exchange for leaving Claire and Greg out of it. The meeting was set for a bustling train station, a place where they hoped the crowd would offer some protection. Claire insisted on being there, despite Greg's protests. When Nathan arrived, his imposing figure stood out even in the crowded terminal. Gavin approached him cautiously, holding a briefcase. "You've caused enough trouble," Gavin said, his voice steady. "This ends here." Nathan smirked. "You're not in a position to make demands, Gavin." Claire and Greg watched from a distance, their nerves stretched taut. But just as Gavin handed over the briefcase, Nathan's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. "This is a setup," Nathan growled. Before anyone could react, chaos erupted. Nathan's men emerged from the crowd, and the station turned into a frenzy of shouting and confusion. A twist of fate in the chaos, Claire noticed something shocking. Trisha was there, but she wasn't watching Nathan. She was watching Gavin. Realization struck like a lightning bolt. "Greg!" Claire shouted. "It's not Nathan. Trisha's been using him as a distraction." Greg's eyes widened as he spotted Trisha slipping away through the crowd, carrying a small bag. They chased after her, weaving through the panicked masses. When they finally cornered her in a side corridor, Trisha's mask of confidence cracked. "You don't understand," she hissed. "Nathan wasn't going to stop. I needed leverage to protect myself." Claire stepped forward, her voice cold. "You put us all in danger to save your own skin." Trisha glared at her. "Don't pretend you're innocent, Claire. You brought this on yourself by opening the door to your past." Justice and redemption in the end. Trisha's betrayal proved to be her undoing. With evidence from the bag she carried, the police were able to tie her to Nathan's operations. Nathan himself was arrested during the chaos at the train station, thanks to Gavin's quick thinking in slipping a GPS tracker into the briefcase. The ordeal left Claire and Greg shaken but united. For the first time in years, they confronted the cracks in their marriage and began the hard work of repairing them. As for Gavin, he decided to leave town, seeking treatment for his illness and vowing to leave the past behind. Before he left, he met Claire one last time. "I'm sorry for everything," Gavin said, his voice heavy with regret. Claire smiled faintly. "Take care of yourself, Gavin, and don't look back." A new beginning months later, Claire and Greg sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset. The storm that had threatened their lives had passed, leaving behind the quiet promise of a fresh start. "Do you regret any of it?" Greg asked softly. Claire thought for a moment before shaking her head. "No, it wasn't easy, but it reminded me what really matters." Greg took her hand, their fingers entwining as the sun dipped below the horizon. Together, they faced the future, stronger than before.